Silas Vance stood on the wooden planks of the Flat Creek station with dust in his teeth and a piece of dry grass between his fingers. The train had already gone, leaving nothing behind but a black smudge of coal smoke against the wide gray sky, and one woman standing next to a single domed trunk. She did not look like 30. That was Silas's first thought. Her hair was the color of a wet walnut shell, but there were thick silver threads running through the sides, and the skin around her eyes was puckered into the deep, permanent creases of someone who had spent her life looking into the sun or looking for trouble. She was 42 if she was a day, and she was wearing a heavy wool traveling suit that had seen 3 separate owners before it ever found its way to her shoulders. On the other side of that windy platform, Clara Albright looked at the man who had written her 3 letters on thick blue paper. He was 35, but his knuckles were scarred from winter branding, and his left shoulder sat lower than his right from an old mishap with a young colt. His hat was salt-stained, and his boots were greased with lard instead of blacking. He looked like a man who spent his nights sleeping on his saddle and his days arguing with steers. They stood 6 feet apart on a platform that smelled of creosote and horse manure, with the wind coming off the North Plains like a cold hand sliding down a collar. "Mr. Vance," she said. Her voice was lower than he expected, steady and dry as the gravel under the railroad ties. "Miss Clara," he said, taking off his hat. The wind immediately took his hair, which was 3 weeks past a cutting. "I have the wagon behind the depot." She looked at his hands, then at his face, and then down at her own small trunk. It was a cheap pine box with tin corners, the kind they sold to people who were leaving a place and did not plan on coming back. She did not offer her hand, and he did not reach for it. Disappointment was a heavy thing, but on the frontier it was as common as the grass, and neither of them was surprised by the weight of it. He lifted her trunk into the back of the spring wagon with one hard pull. It was light, far too light for a woman who had supposedly lived 30 years in Ohio with a family of comfortable weavers. When she climbed up onto the seat, she did not wait for his hand. She simply took hold of the ironwork and hauled herself up with the practiced economy of someone who had been climbing into wagons since she was small. They rode out of the settlement without speaking. The town of Flat Creek was 3 saloons, a dry goods store with a false front, and a livery stable that smelled of wet straw. Behind them, the railroad tracks shrank to a single silver wire in the yellow grass. It took 2 hours to reach the creek. The land did not roll so much as it tilted, rising toward the foothills in long, slow swells that made the horses work. Silas's homestead sat in the crook of a low ridge where 3 cottonwoods grew near a spring that ran clear only in the wet months. When the wagon stopped, Clara did not move. She looked at the house. It was not the timber frame cottage he had described in his letters. It was a soddy built straight into the side of the clay bank, with walls made of thick turf blocks and a roof of willow poles covered with dirt. A crop of wild rye was growing out of the eastern corner of the chimney. It was neat enough, and the door was hung straight on leather hinges, but it was still a hole in the dirt. "A man who cannot afford timber has no business asking for a wife," she said, her eyes fixed on the rye grass growing on the roof. Silas did not look at her. He climbed down and began unhitching the horses. "There is no timber within 40 miles, and freight costs 3 cents a pound from the railhead. The dirt is warm in the winter and cool in July." "You said there was a porch," she said. "There is a bench by the door," he replied, his voice flat. "It is made of pine. I suppose if you sit on it, you are on the porch." She sat on the wagon seat for a long time while he led the horses to the small corral behind the soddy. The mule, Barnaby, who was 30 years old and possessed the dark, suspicious mind of a county judge, came to the fence and gave Clara a long, yellow-toothed stare. Barnaby did not like strangers, and he especially did not like women who wore blue wool in the middle of a dry October. He let out a dry, rattling bray that sounded like a wet pump handle, then turned his back on her and went to sleep. Grief does not leave, but it sometimes makes room for quiet. Silas came back to the wagon, lifted her trunk again, and carried it into the low doorway of the soddy. The inside was small, but it was clean. There was an iron stove in the corner, a table made of split cedar, and 2 chairs with cowhide seats. On the shelf by the window sat a brass pocket watch with a cracked glass. It was not ticking. It had not ticked since the winter of '82, when the snow had come up to the eaves and stayed there until March. Clara came in and stood by the table. She touched the wood with one bare finger, leaving a clean trail through the thin yellow dust. "I have $80 left in the bank at the county seat," Silas said, standing by the door with his hat in his hand. "The train leaves for the east on Friday morning. I can take you back to the station on Thursday, and I will buy your ticket back to Ohio. No hard feelings, and no talk." She looked at him, her eyes dark and very clear in the dim light of the sod house. "Why would you offer that?" "Because you are 42 years old, Miss Clara, and you did not come out here to live in a cellar with a man who has nothing but 2 horses and 40 head of thin cows." She did not flinch at the number. She did not look away. "And you are 35, Mr. Vance, and you did not write to Ohio for a woman who has gray in her hair and a wrist that goes stiff when the rain comes." "No," he said, "I did not." But they did not leave on Thursday. The first hard frost came on a Tuesday, turning the wild rye on the roof to a pale, brittle gold. When Silas woke at 4, he found Clara already at the stove. She had not unpacked her trunk, but she had taken out her apron, a thick white square of linen that smelled of lavender and old trunks. She was making coffee from the parched rye and chicory he kept in a tin canister. It was terrible coffee, thin and bitter as willow bark, but she drank it without a grimace, sitting on the 3-legged stool by the window while the light came up gray over the ridge. "We will wait a week," she said, not looking at him. "I have not been on a train in 5 days, and my bones feel like dry pine. I will stay until next Friday. I will keep the house, and you will do the work." "That is fair," Silas said. He went out to the corral and began his day. Work on a homestead does not care about disappointed people or broken letters. The fence on the north boundary had been pushed down by 3 of Avery's steers, and the ditch below the spring was choked with sand from the autumn rains. Silas worked with his shovel until his hands were raw under his gloves, his thoughts turning over the 70 miles of empty grass between his ridge and the mountains. Respect moved between them quietly, through what was observed and never needed saying. At noon, she brought him 2 biscuits and a piece of salt pork wrapped in a clean rag. The biscuits were hard enough to crack a tooth, but he ate them with his back against a post while she stood 5 yards away, watching the cattle move through the brush. "You do not have enough water for 40 head, she said. "The spring holds if I clear the sand every 3 weeks, he said. "It will freeze in December, she said. "Then I will chop the ice," he replied. She looked at the cattle, her face pale in the autumn light. "They are thin." "They are hardy," he said. "They are Texas cattle. They can live on dry grass and cedar berries if they have to." Barnaby the mule had followed her down from the house, his ears twitching with a slow, mechanical regularity. He had discovered that Clara's apron strings were made of cotton, which he considered a great delicacy, and he had spent the morning trying to sneak up behind her to chew on them. She did not look back, but she reached behind her hip with a small stick and tapped him on the nose without turning around. Barnaby stopped, gave a low snort of indignation, and went back to pretending he was interested in the fence posts. The week went by in 7 separate dawns. On the 3rd day, the red heifer got down in the creek bed. She was young, her first calf due in the spring, and she had slipped on the greasy blue clay near the waterhole. When Silas found her, she was lying on her side with her legs pointing up the bank, her eyes rolled back until the whites showed. He tried to pass a rope under her chest, but the clay was too slick and the heifer was too heavy. Every time he pulled, his boots slipped in the mud, and the heifer let out a low, rattling groan that meant her lungs were filling. Clara appeared at the top of the bank. She was wearing her traveling boots, which were already ruined by the black loam of the creek bottom, and she had her skirt pinned up with 2 wooden pegs. "Get behind her head," she said. "She is too heavy for you," Silas said, his face red from the strain. "I did not ask if she was heavy," Clara said. "I told you to get behind her head." She scrambled down the bank, her hands black with mud before she reached the bottom. She took the rope from his hands, looped it twice around the heifer's hocks, and stood in the greasy water with her teeth set. When Silas lifted the head, she leaned her whole weight against the rope, her shoulders throwing themselves back with a rhythmic, heavy heave that had nothing to do with grace and everything to do with leverage. The heifer came up with a wet, sucking sound, her feet finding purchase on the gravel. She stood shaking for a moment, then trotted off into the brush without looking back at either of them. Silas sat down on a flat stone, his knees shaking. He had mud on his nose, and his shirt was torn at the elbow. Clara stood 3 feet away, her blue wool skirt caked with blue clay up to the knees, and her hair hanging down in damp, silver-threaded strings. She looked at her hands, which were bleeding at the knuckles where the hemp rope had bitten. "You have a stubborn look about you, Mr. Vance," she said. "It is the only thing that keeps the dirt from falling in," he said. She let out a short, dry sound that might have been a laugh if she had been a woman who laughed often. Then she turned and walked back toward the house, her boots squelching in the grass at every step. By Thursday, the wind had turned from the south, bringing the dry, dusty smell of the high plains. Neighbor Avery rode up around noon. He was an older man, his skin the color of an old boot that had been left in the creek, and his horse was as thin as his conversation. He stayed in his saddle, his eyes wandering over the soddy, the small corral, and the woman who was hanging 3 gray wool shirts on the wire line. "I heard you had a cousin coming from Ohio," Avery said, his voice creaking like an ungreased axle. "She is my wife," Silas said, standing by the wagon wheel with a spoke shave in his hand. Avery looked at Clara. She did not turn around, but her back went very straight as she pinned the sleeve of a shirt to the wire. "She looks like she has seen some winters, Silas." "She has seen 42 of them," Silas said, his voice dropping into that quiet, heavy register that made the horses stop chewing. "And every one of them was spent in a place where men learned to mind their own stock." Avery's horse shifted, its shoes clicking on the stones. Avery looked at Silas's hand on the wagon wheel, then at the rifle scabbard hanging from the saddle on the fence. He did not say anything else about Clara. "I have 2 barrels of salt pork coming from the railhead next week," Avery said. "If you want a hand with the ditch, I can send my boy." "We will manage," Silas said. Avery nodded once, touched his hat to the woman's back, and rode out. He was not a bad neighbor, but he was a man who lived by what he could see, and he had not seen anything on the Vance place that looked like a long future. There is no shame in taking a while to find the path, but the winter does not wait for you to find your boots. That evening, the cold came back with a hard, dry snap. Silas built the fire up with cedar knots he had been saving for the hard months, and the small sod room filled with the sweet, oily smell of the wood. Clara sat at the table with her sewing basket, her fingers moving quickly over the sleeve of his torn shirt. The brass watch on the shelf remained silent, its hands frozen at 20 minutes past 4. "Why did you write that you had a timber house?" she asked. She did not look up from her needle. He was whittling a new peg for the harness rack, the white shavings falling into the wood box between his feet. Because nobody is going to come to a soddy, he said. A woman in Ohio does not know what a sod house is. She thinks it is a cave. She thinks there are snakes in the ceiling. There are snakes in the ceiling, she said. Only in August, he said, and they are only bull snakes. They keep the mice down. That is comforting, she said, her voice dry as the shavings. I lied because I was tired of eating my own biscuits, Silas said. He stopped whittling and looked at his hands. I have been here 6 years. My brother died at the river in '79, and I have been alone since then. A man alone on a claim is just a wild animal that knows how to build a fire. She put her needle down. She did not touch him, and she did not look at him, but her hands lay quiet in her lap. I lied because I was 42, she said. In Columbus, a woman of 42 who has no money and no father is a housekeeper who does not get paid. My sister's husband looked at me every morning like I was a sack of oats he had to pay storage on. I wanted my own door, even if the door was hung on leather. They sat in the quiet of the dirt walls, the wind brushing against the wild rye on the roof with a soft, dry hiss. The week was up on Friday morning. The wagon was ready by 6. The horses stood with their heads down, their breath coming in long, white plumes in the gray light. Clara's trunk was in the back, covered with a piece of canvas to keep the frost off. Silas stood by the wheel, his hands deep in his pockets. The road is dry. We will make the station by 10. Clara came out of the soddy. She was wearing her traveling hat, but she had her white apron tucked under her arm. She did not look at the wagon. She looked at the garden patch behind the house, which was nothing but dry stalks and gray dirt. You have no turnips, she said. The grasshoppers took them in September, he said. A house without turnips is a poor place, she said. She walked past the wagon and went to the corral. Barnaby the mule was standing by the gate, his long ears tilted forward. He looked at her apron, then at her face, and let out a soft, blowing snort that was almost polite. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a small, dried apple paring, and held it out on her flat palm. Barnaby took it with his thick, gray lips, his whiskers tickling her wrist. He is a terrible mule, Silas said, coming up behind her. He has no respect for the harness. He is old, she said. He has earned his opinion. She turned to face him, her back against the corral poles. Her face was pale in the cold morning, but her eyes were very dark and steady. I will stay until the spring, she said. Silas did not move. Why? Because the ground is too hard to dig turnips now anyway, she said, and because your biscuits are worse than mine. It took him 3 weeks to build the frame. He did not ask her to stay past March, and he did not speak of the railroad ticket again. But every morning after he cleared the water ditch, he took his axe and went down to the creek. There were no pines, but there were cottonwoods in the deep draws that had grown tall and straight in the shelter of the clay banks. They were heavy, green wood, difficult to split and slow to dry, but they were timber. He hauled them up one by one behind the old gray mule, his face black with sweat and his shoulders bruised from the chain drafts. He squared them with his broadaxe on the flat ground behind the soddy, his strokes falling with a slow, heavy rhythm that could be heard all the way to Avery's Ridge. Clara did not help him with the logs, but she brought him water, and she kept his clothes mended with the lavender-scented thread from her box. One afternoon, Mr. Henderson came by in his buggy. Henderson was a land agent from the county seat, a man who wore a hard white collar and had nails that were clean and pink. He did not get out of his carriage. Vance, he said, looking at the squared logs on the grass, you are putting a lot of work into a claim that has a heavy note on it. The note is paid through May, Silas said, his axe resting against his boot. May is not far off, Henderson said. The railroad is looking at the North Ridge for the new spur. If they come through, this land will be worth 60 cents an acre. If they do not, it will be worth what it is now, which is nothing. I have a buyer who will take the 40 head and the homestead off your hands for $500. Cash. Silas looked at the timber, then at the man in the buggy. The wood was wet, and it would warp if it was not pinned correctly, but it was honest. "We will stay," Silas said. Henderson looked at Clara, who was standing near the door of the soddy with an iron skillet in her hand. "You have a wife now, Silas. A woman needs a real roof. A soddy is no place for a woman of her station." "She has a roof," Silas said, "and she has her own door." Henderson shook his head, turned his team, and drove out. The buggies of land agents always left thin, shallow tracks in the prairie sod, tracks that the next rain would wash away as if they had never been. There is a safety that has nothing to do with locks or timber. It is the safety of knowing that when the wind comes from the north, there is someone else in the room who knows how to hold the door. By February, the walls of the new house were 4 feet high. It was small, only 12 by 14, but the joists were notched deep and the sills were bedded in clean sand from the creek. Silas worked on it in the evenings by the light of a lantern hung from a tripod of willow poles. One night, the wind dropped and the snow came down in silent, heavy flakes that looked like feathers in the lantern light. Clara came out with his coat, her boots making no sound in the fresh white drift. She stood inside the frame of the new door, looking up at the sky through the open rafters. "It is very small," she said. "It has 2 windows," Silas said. "One for the morning and one for the ridge." She touched the wood of the door frame. It was rough-sawn cottonwood, still sappy and cold from the winter. "You are not what I expected," she said, her voice very quiet in the falling snow. Silas stood with his hammer in his hand, his face shadow-marked by the yellow light of the lantern. "Neither are you, ma'am," he said. The silence stayed between them for a long time, but it was not the cold silence of the railway platform. It was the quiet of 2 people who had looked at the ledger and knew exactly what they owed and what they had left to spend. "I have $70 left in the box," she said. "It is for the glass." "I have the timber paid for," Silas said. "We will buy the glass in April." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the brass watch. He had cleaned the rust off the gears with a feather and some kerosene, and though the glass was still cracked, the balance wheel was moving with a dry, rhythmic click that could be heard above the falling snow. He set it on the squared log that would be the windowsill of their bedroom. The ticking was small, but it was steady. The spring came in a rush of green mud and yellow daisies. The new house was finished on a Tuesday in April. It smelled of raw cottonwood and linseed oil, and the glass in the windows was so clear that Barnaby the mule spent 2 hours trying to walk through the front room before he discovered the screen. He was very angry about the screen, and he spent the rest of the afternoon standing by the well, giving the new pine door a series of dark, reproachful looks. They moved her trunk in first. It sat in the corner of the bedroom, no longer looking like a box for someone who was leaving, but like something that had finally found its floor. Silas stood on the small porch he had built out of the leftover sills. The timber was already beginning to gray under the sun, but it was straight, and the door hung true on iron hinges he had bought from the blacksmith in Flat Creek. "You don't always know the moment when the drifting ends," he said, his hand on the post. "Sometimes you only know it looking back. But it ends." Clara came out and stood next to him. She was wearing her white apron, and her hands were clean and smelled of lemon soap. She looked down the road toward the station, where the grass was already hiding the old wagon tracks. "The train will be coming through on Friday," she said. "Let it," Silas said. And they went inside and shut the door against the wind.